can sort of get set up because it takes a tiny bit to get going. And I will start the recording. So we're now recording, and so I think we're ready to go.
All right.
Excellent. So hello, everyone. We are very pleased to have you to this 24/7 session. I'm very excited about 24/7 sessions because they have like really energetic presentations. But when you are in your presentation, please be aware of time and make sure that you don't go over time. Before we start with the first presentation, I would like to let you know that there is a code of contact in this conference, and we expect everyone in the conference to adhere to this code of contact. And should you witness or experience any violations, please report it to either Sarah or myself, or to the email address that has been emailed to you. And sessions will be recorded and posted to Zenodo in the near future. And then further to that, there is going to be a live stream on YouTube. And if you have any questions, you should email Sarah. So I'm going to start this session's presentation with the Elevating Open Data, Building an Accessible Environment for Data Stewardship in Research Libraries with CADRE. And we have a lot of presenters in this slide. So it's Jackie, if I pronounce it correctly, Wilkinson, Jamie Wittenberg, Patricia Mabry, Valentin Penchev, Robert Van Rins, and Ethan Friedmansky. And they are from the Indiana University Library. Thank you. From the Indiana University Libraries, University Libraries of the Colorado Boulder, Health Partners, Indiana University Network, Science Institute, and Big Ten Academic Alliance. So I don't know if you present all of them like together or if someone is doing the presentation, but go ahead.
Just me.
All right.
Okay. Thank you for the introduction, Nancy. You saved me some time. All right. Okay, yeah, so thank you all for joining. I have been having internet issues, so hopefully it goes smoothly. So today I'll be talking about the CADRE project at Indiana University. Nancy did a great job introducing the affiliate partners on campus. So I'll go ahead and get started. So there are many problems with and issues with big data in the university and academic library setting, right? Large license data can be cost prohibitive in many senses, right? There's the actual money to purchase the data, right? But also the cost for the infrastructure, right? And the labor cost to maintain it, right? It takes a lot of time. Right. And all these costs can magnify current inequalities that already exist within or between universities within countries, right? Or between universities across countries, right? And a situation can arise where only those institutions that can afford these costs, right, can afford the data, right? And as private data sets become more prevalent, right, this problem is only going to get worse or more expensive. Right? And current models of big data, right, depend on individual researchers or teams or individual libraries to kind of provide the infrastructure and the licensing of this data, on their own, right? So we say there needs to be a standardized and sustainable platform to host this data, right? And in addition to these infrastructural issues, right, there's some inequality between technological skills between researchers, right? To work with big data, you have to have advanced technological skills, right, to even get the data in a format that's usable. So this also can create an inequality, right, where traditionally more STEM-focused backgrounds have been the ones to study big data, though this is changing. So CADRE poses itself as a solution to these problems. CADRE, but what is it? CADRE is a cloud-based multifunctional data platform, right? It provides access to the data and a platform to do some analysis and visualization. All right. It also distributes the costs across member institutions. with non-members having access to affordable tiered memberships. And by distributing the costs between these members and non-members, right, it makes the platform affordable and sustainable. Right, and we also standardize access and standardize the data itself. Right, accessing and working with each data set is similar and familiar. Right, so if you can work with one data set, you should be able to work with the other. Right, you don't need to devote your whole career to learning one data set. Right, or be highly specialized to work with a given data set. Right, and finally, as a summary, right, it makes it working with big data easy to use. Right, no advanced data skills are required, at least in terms of accessing and working with the data. Right, there's an easy to use GUI interface. But how does it work? As a cloud platform, it's not going to be unfamiliar to those who work with other cloud-based platforms, right? The user logs into the platform under an affiliated institution, right, using their credentials. Then you select the data that you want to work with from a list, right? And then after that, you can build a query using the GUI interface. So while SQL or database languages are not required, the structure of the GUI will be familiar to those who know how to do like SQL queries or other database queries. All right, and after that, you have a few options. You can do some analysis and visualization tools in a Jupyter notebook on the platform, right? Or you can just export it out and use your normal workflow, right? And then we also have a marketplace where people can post their analyses and data manipulation, so you can use tools created by others, right? And then at the end, you can choose to share these on the marketplace and let others access them. So I'll take a little bit of the end time to talk about our latest offering, the United States Trademark and Patent Office data, which I'm just going to call it USTPO for now. It's our first open data set on the platform, adding to the Microsoft Academic Graph and then also the Web of Science. So the USTPO data, unlike other bibliometric data sets, relatively, there hasn't been as much research. So the USTPO data set, provides researchers with a lot of opportunities and make contributions in their fields. CADRE makes the USTPO easy to work with. While it is open data, right, to do this on your own, you would have to download many, many files spread out across many years, right? It's a large and complicated data set with complicated data structures, and CADRE makes it easy to use. The USTPO data and other bibliometric data aren't just useful for academic research questions, right? They can also be useful for institutional research questions, right? It provides institutions ideas about current economic trends, management techniques, innovation policy. So it's useful for institutional as well as academic research. And just covering some of the challenges and lessons we've learned from a big idea perspective, right? Open access sometimes conflicts with traditional academic incentives, right? And this kind of highlights contradictions that exist within the academy. Also, balancing funding and financial accessibility of tools is very tricky. On the one hand, the services cost a lot of money to run, a lot of time, a lot of labor, but they also need to be affordable so people and universities can use them. And if this is not balanced correctly, right, we can further exacerbate, inequalities in data access that already exist. Right. And then finally, even with the proper technology and skills, big data is difficult to wrangle, right? In both terms of resources and human labor. We realize that it just takes time, to host these large and complicated data sets. So, it was a short presentation. I wasn't able to cover everything, but CADRE does offer a 3-month no-cost trial period for institutions interested in trying the service before committing funds. Right, trial users receive access to all available features. This is our general contact info. You can also reach out to me directly, but we're currently taking suggestions and recommendations for future data sets. And here's a more robust list of our contact info: our website, email, and Twitter. We have a newsletter and some upcoming events. We have a demo demonstrating the platform and the USTPO data on June 24th. You can find information at the website. And we're currently developing working groups. So you should see that on the website too. But if you're interested in that, please reach out. And at the end, I attached our current partners. I didn't have enough time to go through this in the presentation. And while I'm not the best person to talk about this, at the end of the slides, there's a summary of kind of how the technology works in the background. So that's it.
Thank you very much. We are going to move on to the next presentation.
Okay.
And then in the end, we are going to have some time to take questions.
Okay.
So this has been a very interesting presentation, and I'm looking forward to the next one, which is using research profiles as a service, RPaS, to populate an institutional repository. And this presentation is going to be by Agnes, by Agnes Gambill, and it is from the Appalachian State University from the United States of America.
All right, good morning, and from Appalachian State University. I'm Agnes Gambill, Head of Scholarly Communication. So we've implemented a new and very practical service at Appalachian that has led to a dramatic increase in faculty participation with our university's institutional repository. We've branded that service RPaS, which stands for Research Profiles as a Service. Today, I'm going to walk you through how and why it works. Populating an IR at any university can be a challenge. Many faculty still don't have a clear understanding about open access, and some faculty view depositing work in a local IR as an unnecessary extra demand on their time, especially when their work is already present in competing academic social media platforms. Of course, populating an IR in the middle of a global health crisis adds further complexities. So, how can librarians and repository managers create momentum and interest in IRs during unusual circumstances, such as COVID-19 and work from home scenarios? One solution includes offering research profiles as a service, or RPaS. RPaS was developed at Appalachian State University to help faculty members build their online presence and increase their awareness and engagement with NC Docs, the university's IR. While there are many other valuable research profile service platforms out there, we took the pragmatic view that any research profile increases visibility and therefore demand for access to open versions of scholarship. One benefit of using NC Docs is that scholarly articles that are associated with a research profile are automatically indexed in Google Scholar. This is why our scholarly communication team always followed up with faculty to offer the additional service of adding their research publications to their new profiles. RPaS was created in response to the many challenges stemming from the COVID-19 crisis, such as the emergency transition to online and hybrid teaching, managing healthcare for self and family, and conference cancellations. In the middle of the COVID-19 crisis, Appalachian State University administered a faculty parenting and caregiving survey. The results of the survey revealed that faculty were spending 12.4 hours a week homeschooling children, and that research was the work category most impacted by the COVID-19 crisis. The survey also revealed that women were disproportionately impacted. In fact, 85% of the respondents who had experienced a moderate or high impact on their work were women. The results of this survey and a broader awareness of the impacts of COVID-19 on everyone in academia compelled our scholarly communication team to rethink what faculty needed during these unusual times. Because of the increased demands on faculty workloads, we understood the need for a simple solution. Because of remote work and canceled conferences, we knew that faculty needed a way to connect with other researchers and the library. And because there was no time to conduct research, we saw an opportunity to refocus efforts on building an online presence through exposure and promotion of faculty research expertise. We discovered that all of these needs were intrinsically linked to educating faculty about the value of having an online presence and the necessity of having a research profile. From there, the RPaS service model was born. The service model for RPaS starts with outreach. We sent an email announcement offering the service to all faculty members through a university-based listserv every 2 weeks for several months. Requests came in immediately, usually within 24 hours, and then sporadically over the following 3 or 4 days. Then research profiles were created. Our scholarly communication team worked with faculty members to design their profile, which includes a professional photo, description of their background and research interests, and contact information. It's as simple as that and takes approximately 15 minutes to create. The goal of our scholarly communication team was to create each profile quickly, within 2 business days if possible. Once the research profile was created, we asked faculty members if we could also add their published scholarship to their new profile and by extension to our institutional repository. We made the process as simple as possible. Here's the sample text of our email announcement. As you can see, it's short and sweet. We use keywords to grab the attention of faculty members, keywords that emphasize career advancement and new professional opportunities. We also made sure to inform faculty that no work was required on their part. Response rates to RPaS service announcements were dramatically more than response rates to article ingest announcements that we had received prior to COVID-19. In fact, we achieved a 12 times increase in IR-related participation after 2 months of marketing our new RPaS service. Also, 100% of faculty who requested a new research profile agreed to let us deposit their research in the university's institutional repository in a follow-up request by our scholarly communication team. The rapid increase in participation compelled us to consider hiring additional staff to support the influx of new requests. So, why does RPaS work? We designed our outreach in accordance with impactful marketing techniques, which puts psychology and human behavior at the center of decision-making. By understanding the changing needs of faculty during the COVID-19 crisis, we were able to create an attractive, simple, and practical solution that triggered a quick impulse for decision-making. We appealed to the human desire for social connection and career advancement. And we also employed the foot in the door technique. By starting with a small request, we had the opportunity to follow up with a second, larger request to populate our local repository in CDocs. By implementing research profiles as a service, the library has enjoyed 3 successful outcomes, including increased visibility to open research, valuable exposure for NC Docs, and new opportunities to discuss the advantages of open access with members of our university and community, a triple win. I hope you will be encouraged by our success to implement this practical and efficient service at your home institution.
Excellent. So another presentation, a very interesting presentation, has just finished. And do not forget that you can ask all your questions at the chat area. And we can move on with the next presentation, which is called Repository Migration. Repository Migration, how it started and how it's going. And that presentation is from Nicholas Homenda and Juliet Hardesty. And the affiliation is the Indiana University Libraries from the United States again.
Hi, this is Julie. Can you hear me?
Yes, very well.
Okay, let me share my screen. All right. So hi, I am Julie Hardesty, along with Nick Homenda from Indiana University. We presented at Open Repositories in 2018 on what we referred to at the time as the ecosystem of repository migration. So this is an update on how that migration is going. So back in 2018, we talked about what we were evaluating in our process for working through migrating from Fedora 3 to Fedora 4 for our 20 plus years of digitized content that we've been managing in our Fedora 3 repository. We evaluated the different types of content and data structures we had in our Fedora 3 repository and formulated a plan for approaching migration of that content to Fedora 4. Our lessons at that point were from our evaluation of our digital repository content. As you can see, it was actually a step for us to figure out what we even had in the repository. As we evaluated all the various types of content and structures, we grouped them by their complexity and available accompanying data. Our thought was to focus on levels of content complexity within the repository. So the smoothest Fedora 3 content to migrate were those items we knew the most about and those that had the simplest structures. The more complex the structures and the less we knew about the content, the more complicated the migration would be to process them over into Fedora 4. This rainbow of complication we're showing here applies to content we examined in one of our services, which is called Variations, and that's a digital repository for audio sound recordings and digitized sheet music. While we knew our ecosystem of repository migration included the services that provide discovery and access to this content, our lessons at the time did not encompass what migration meant for our services. Our rainbow of complication, while constructed within a particular service here, did not include anything factoring in how the service itself would evolve or migrate to support the migrated repository content. So how's the migration going? We're taking off, but not yet in full flight. I'll pass things over to Nick now to share what we've experienced since 2018 in migrating content and updating or establishing new services for that content.
Thanks, Julie. Pages Online was a service we launched in 2017 as a Samvera-based service for digitized sheet music and materials accompanying sound recordings from the music library at IU. That service paved the way for materials with similar characteristics to also use it. We continued by migrating hundreds of digitized special collections books. These all require retrieving preservation quality images from our tape storage to reprocess into the image and OCR derivatives needed. In 2020, we ingested about 70 volumes of concert programs held by the music library. Pages Online can create structural containers within a work viewable as an interactive table of contents within the universal viewer, and that feature was needed by these materials. And finally, the Chemistry of Isaac Newton project received a grant to revitalize its website with IIIF image handling. Pages Online serves as the repository for their manuscript images and allows the project team to create, modify, and host IIIF manifests that their new website needs. We can go to the next slide. These collections all use library catalog metadata, but most of our digital collections have custom metadata profiles. In 2018, we talked about the need for flexible metadata, and we worked with Notch8 to build it into Hyrax. It's named Allenson Flex in honor of the late Julie Allenson, who developed the Samvera gem based off her work in the Samvera community. We're also grateful for Notch8 for developing BulkRax, which is a gem for bulk import and export. It has gained broader use in the Samvera community, and we implemented it as well. And finally, Notch8 recreated a Pages Online feature, which is the ability to create PDFs on the fly for any given work from the image server. With these additional features, we were able to launch our new service called Digital Collections, and we released our minimum viable product and a pilot version of the service this spring with a few image collections in it. Over the years, we've also built a bunch of boutique websites for unique digital collections. For example, we took the first steps in migrating the Hoagie Carmichael collection by constructing an archival finding aid for its contents and making its image collections available in Image Collections Online and then into the pilot digital collection service. Last summer, our intern Jennifer Christie built a digital exhibition using Omeka that replicated many of the custom features the original Hoagie website had. We feel it's important to migrate the collections themselves into our latest services, and then build additional digital exhibition sites using Omeka or Spotlight when needed. Even though sites like these are easier to maintain than the legacy ones, there's still a lot of labor to build and sustain them.
So I'll talk about this service. Our other main service is Archives Online, which provides access to archival and special collections described with XML encoded finding aids. Many of these finding aid collections have items that have been digitized and are available within the context of the finding aid description online. Those digitized items are part of the content that has to be migrated out of Fedora 3 into Fedora 4. Since this service also involves encoding finding aid descriptions that are not managed by our Fedora repository, the migration approach has been more service-centered than repository content-centered. Our first focus for updating the service was to make it easier to create the finding aid descriptions so collection managers from across all of our campuses would be able to provide online access to their archival and special collection descriptions, whether they know how to encode finding aids in XML or not. We migrated our finding aid creation and management to ArchiveSpace in the spring of 2020 and implemented ArcLight as the Blacklight powered discovery and access layer that summer. We're currently still running our legacy finding aid site since the digital objects have not migrated from Fedora 3 into Fedora 4 yet. But this set of content for this service is next in line and will be added to the digital collection service. The IIIF-enabled view of the digitized content that will be available after migration will be shown in the Archives Online service using an embedded viewer within the context of the finding aid description again.
So since 2018, we've learned more lessons. And here are a few of them. The first is to keep your minimum viable product and pilot service minimal. By fully handling the needs of a couple different collections, you can work through a bunch of common use cases you'll encounter. If you focus on accommodating all edge cases, your pilot service will likely never go into production. As we approach more complex use cases in our rainbow of complication, we're setting new goals for the features needed to fully accommodate them. The second lesson is that minor details can be major and challenge even the most generous of timelines. For example, an issue with our new hosting environment caused a problem with bulk uploading, which delayed our timeline by a couple of months, which leads me to our third lesson. Even through a global pandemic, we still needed to provide a timeline of when we would reach certain milestones in our migration. It's easy enough to say by the end of the year, but accurately forecasting requires data. This means assessing how much work is completed each sprint and benchmarking the time it takes to fully migrate each collection. I'm learning to use this approach right now, and it's helping to provide more realistic timelines and informing additional areas to improve. And that is all we have. Thank you for attending the presentation.
Thank you.
Excellent. That was a very interesting Fedora migration. Before I will have to apologize because I skipped one of the presentation. It's Thomas's and Francisco's from the University, Concordia University in Canada. So I'm terribly sorry that I have done this. I skipped totally the line. So the next presentation, we are just going to go like a little bit higher. So it's Shallow Beyond the Repository, development of a custom metadata management software. And the presenters are, as I said, Thomas Neugebauer and Francisco Berizbetia. I think that I did not say this properly. So once again, my apologies.
Okay, can you hear me well?
Yes.
Okay, great. Okay. Can you see the screen? Is like everything's fine? Okay.
Yes.
Yep.
Yes.
Okay, great. So I'm just gonna start. First, like my name is Francisco Berizbeitia. So, and I'm gonna present it on behalf of myself and Tomas Neugebauer, and we both work at Concordia University Libraries. I'm a software developer, and Tomas is like the systems librarian there. And we want to present Swallow, which is our metadata management system that we develop, and we're going to see. We're going to briefly talk about the problem. We're going to talk about our solution, what we learned in the next step, which is kind of in line of what like our previous presentations have been doing. And I would like to start by giving some context on why we built this. And this is within the scope of a larger project, which is called the Spoken Web, which is a partnership of it's a multi-year, funded research project that encompasses a network of universities across North America. Mostly, most of them are in Canada, all over the country, and some of them in the US. And it's a partnership to do literary study. Okay, and they focus, one of the main focuses on an object they call the audio text, and it's basic, and we can see it as a read audio text. It's like when they read the text, okay, like say poetry readings, for example. And that's the main object that we're describing. And the part that we were tasked to deal with is they needed to aggregate and consolidate all these collections that were dispersed in all these different institutions. So each of these institutions had their own, repository systems where they give discovery and access to these objects. And so we need a way to consolidate the metadata, but not the actual objects. And also one of the mandates was to go and seek out on catalog unknown collections that are like basically in boxes in people's garage and so on and so forth. So we need also an interactive way to do this. So in a way, creating this central metadata repository, in this sense, the metadata became the research data from this project. So it's very central, it's at the heart of what they're trying to do. So to do this, it required a very extensive metadata schema. So we're talking about 60 or 60, more than 60 fields. So we need to describe the object in a lot of detail. And usually the first thing you try to do when you tackle this sort of problem is to use a spreadsheet, you know, because they're easy to deploy. Everybody knows how to use them. You can share them. But I guess you have an issue when repeatable fields comes out. Like, for example, you have multiple, you know, you can have more than one, say, author, then you need a column for each one. So it becomes messy, and you can imagine like a large metadata schema, all accommodated in rows, like it doesn't scale well, and the user experience ends up like really well. So this was like initially, actually there was an approach like this, and of course it didn't work. The second approach that we thought about was to, well, let's build like a standard, normal, relational database sort of approach. And this is the translation, actually, what I'm trying to sell is the actual translation that we made when we're trying to move the database, the schema to a relational database. And as you can see, we have quite a few tables, you know, with one-to-one relationships, end-to-end relationships. And like this is nice because it's fast. And you can have control vocabularies here implemented like quite easily. The user experience will be better, but the problem with this was that it's really hard to change. And as you can imagine, like adding a field, removing a field, or even worse, changing the cardinality of a field in a scenario like this, it requires like it will require a lot of recoding and rewiring and data migration. So it's not hard. So it kind of end up working sort of like a Procrustean bed sort of solution. So in which you try to avoid, you put yourself in a situation where you want to avoid making the change. You end up like trying to like squeeze the data into the current schema. So that's not something that we thought might work. So what we say, well, what we thought about was like to decouple completely the schema definition from the data, the values of these definitions. So on one side we have what we call the schema definitions, where it's just like it's a JSON file where they define, you know, the metadata schema, where we define the control coverage and we define the maps. When I talk about it, what those input and export maps are. And in the database, we only store the values of those things. And the system that provides the CRUD functionality to manage, you know, to create, read, update, and deal with this is an engine that will take on one side the schema definition. It will take the data that is stored in a JSON verb in the database, and they will create the interface accordingly. So in this case, we can change the schema very easily. If you have a new schema, it won't break what was done before. So it creates a very agile system, and we're very, very happy with the result. And in a sense, you can see here, like the idea of Swallow is to be a bridge also. And it's another characteristic of our system is that this is not a repository. This is not an access system. This is not to provide a front end. The idea is to take what's out there being in the form of like, so we take what the metadata that is stored like in different access systems, and then we have means to map that to our schema. We have an interactive cataloging interface that allows for new items and new collections to be created within the system. And then we export those to whatever we need to do, whether if you want to make a front end, which is one of the use cases that we have, and to MongoDB, for example, to a data preservation layer, to Wikidata, or whatever, or to art, to doing analytics, you know, research stuff. So the idea of Swallow is to be this bridge, you know, between this bridge to where we consolidate and create this homogeneous, more homogeneous and coherent collection. These are, I'm gonna go through quickly. Like the idea is like, this is very simple to configure. You have all the configurations files are JSON files. And as you can see here on the left, we have, it's quite easy. It's just fields, the type of field, whether it's repeatable or not, you know, and how you want it to be rendered, you know. It also allows for the use of control vocabularies, as you can see in the case of role. And those are defined in a different configuration file, which looks like this. And here, the one thing I want to mention here that I think is interesting is that we were thinking about, like from the get-go, to use URIs as part of the control vocabularies. Even though we're not now capable of exporting linked data compatible formats, we are, like, it's there, like the information is there. So we hope to do that in the near future, because we believe that there will be use cases for when you want to output like something that looks more like that can be, then you can ingest into a knowledge graph and do some reasoning on top of it, you know, as a research, as part of our research workflow.
You should be wrapping up because your 7 minutes are over. Okay.
Well, this is the last thing I want to say is just it's a very lean system. You know, it uses like the most common and lean stack that we can think of. It actually runs on like a very, very, very cheap machine that doesn't need the computer power. And we're working on a next iteration in which will allow us more flexibility to accommodate different types of levels of descriptions. So, okay, I'm sorry I went over the time.
That's all right. Thank you very much for the solo presentation. Another interesting presentation. I love 24/7. They are so exciting. And the next presentation are going to be by Sadi Ruza, who is going to talk about increasing the A in OA, how accessibility work in repositories should influence publishing agreements. And the affiliation is the MIT libraries from the United States of America. So, Sadi?
I can't share my screen while someone else is sharing.
Can I need to stop sharing? I'll do that.
Yes, please. Thank you.
Sorry. Okay.
No problem.
Okay.
Here we go. Sorry about that. There. Can you see my slides?
Yes.
Thank you. Okay, so hi everybody. I'm Sadie Rosa. I'm the collection strategist for repository services at MIT Libraries. And today I'm going to be talking about the accessibility of content in our institutional repositories and how work on this should affect agreements with publishers. To follow along with an accessible version of these slides, you can go to tinyurl.com/increasing-the-A. So at this point, there have been many presentations, articles, and conversations about the way that our current open access practices don't actually make content completely open. One of the ways that open content isn't fully open is that so much of it can't be as meaningfully consumed by all users, especially those that use screen readers or otherwise have print disabilities. For this presentation, when I'm talking about scholarly articles, I'm talking about the two versions that are most common in MIT's OA collection, both of which are usually shared as PDFs. The author-accepted manuscript is a peer-reviewed version of the article, but it hasn't yet been copy edited or formatted by the publisher. And the version of record is what the publisher shares out on their site. I share these definitions partially to be clear in my use of jargon, and partially because it's important to know who has put what effort into the creation of each version, especially if we're talking about how much money is exchanged between universities and publishers. So one of the reasons that I started with PDFs is because I know that there has been a lot of work about making PDFs accessible. And I thought that maybe as that work was being done and more tools were being developed in that area, that the accessibility of PDFs would just be getting better over time. From analyzing a representative sample of MIT's OA articles for accessibility criteria that I was able to automatically check using Adobe Acrobat, I determined that there was actually no increase in compliance with those accessibility criteria for either versions of records or authors accepted manuscripts between 2009 all the way up to 2020. Clearly, we need to force some action or nothing's going to happen. So I look at it like this. Someone, or preferably all of us, have to take some responsibility and start doing something. Either we need the publishers to be making the content accessible, or we need to make sure that there's nothing in our publisher agreement that will get in the way of the libraries doing the work ourselves. And as I'm insisting on this responsibility, I also want to just take the time to recognize that making content accessible does take time and resources. The work often has a manual component, even if some of it can be automated. And to automate as much of it as possible, it would take a lot of effort upfront to create a system that supports those best practices. I also want to point out that while we currently rely on PDFs in traditional scholarly publishing contexts, there are other options that we can and should explore. EPUBs and HTML are both recognized for how much more easily compatible they are with screen readers. Also, within a repository, there are many ways accessibility enhancing workflows can be implemented, including tracking accessibility compliance, remediation efforts, and possibly more extreme measures. So now, when we talk about experimenting with new formats or policies and workflows in our institutional repositories, it's important to ask if there are any barriers to us doing so. If we start with a deposited PDF, then doing an accessibility remediation to generate an accessible copy that we would give to a specific screen reader user is more than likely a fair use. That's totally fine. However, making that remediated version the main file that's available to anyone downloading the work on our site is slightly less strong of a case. And then converting the information into an entirely different format, such as an HTML version we share on a web page, is even less of a strong fair use case. So if we don't have explicitly clear rights to make non-commercial derivatives of a work, which is the case for only about 50% of the content in MIT's OA collection, then we are limited in what we can do to experiment with meeting accessibility needs. As I started making a list of everything we would need in our publisher agreements to be able to experiment around the accessibility of OA articles in institutional repositories, my list started to look a lot like another list that I've become familiar with. The MIT framework for publisher contracts is based around 6 principles, many of which would not just help us make content available in front of a paywall, but would also help us make more of our content accessible. I'm going to go through the way that some of these specifically interact with accessibility work, but across the board, my point is that while we're using these principles in our negotiations, we should emphasize that their impact on accessibility efforts is an important part of how the framework can be used to push for a more equitable scholarly communication system. And I also want to throw in that, just like for other parts of agreements, to increase openness, there is room for experimentation in how we address these accessibility needs. So now onto the specific principles. Accessibility work done by publishers would be a value-added service, which I think we would be willing to pay for as long as the costs weren't actually being undertaken, as long as the costs were actually being undertaken by the publishers and the effort wasn't being passed along to the author who's not being compensated for additional labor. If the publisher implemented a technical system that would help make the accessibility compliance easier, we might even be willing to help pay for some of those upfront costs. But perhaps we don't want to pay as much year over year if it's not continuing to cost the publisher that much money each year. If authors retain copyright and generous reuse rights, then there's no licensing barriers to authors and libraries doing the work and making more accessible derivatives. Clearly, we want authors to be able to use all possible methods to make their work OA, including OA policies, which we don't want publishers to make them waive. Additionally, auto deposits from publishers are a great way to increase the amount of content deposited into the IR. Because both of these principles increase the amount of content in the IR, they not only increase how much research is available in front of a paywall, but they also increase the number of articles that can fall under the accessibility efforts and workflows that libraries implement. One thing to keep in mind, though, is that if publishers are doing some accessibility work, then it will likely only be reflected in the version of record, which would mean that that would be the version that we would want auto-deposited into the IR. Accessibility efforts, especially for screen reader users, have a lot of benefits to computational access. If we're talking about computational access with publishers already, why not give them the 1-2 punch of both more meaningful computational access and more accessibility? Ultimately, accessibility already falls in line with what we're doing. If we're comfortable giving publishers the money to do the accessibility work themselves, then that needs to fall under the same transparency measures that we're expecting for other services. If we want to undertake the accessibility work ourselves, then we need to use the importance of accessibility to add even more thrust behind the arguments that support rights retention and green OA. Even getting these in place is not going to be the end of this work. We'll still need to determine how to assess accessibility compliance, as well as how to handle the existing corpus of inaccessible scholarly work. But now is the time to take these important first steps. Here are some resources that impacted my thinking around this, references for my slides, and my email address, which I would be happy to talk to people about this further. Thank you.
That's great. Thanks a lot, Sadi. And we are moving to the next to the last presentation for today. The presentation has the title, "We've got a digital repository. Now what do we do with it?" And it is from Kent Douglas Reynolds, Bianca Parisi, and Cindy Rigg. and they are from Niagara College, Canada. So if you can set up your slides.
Great. Thanks for the introduction, Nancy. Hello and welcome to our presentation, everyone. Presenting will be myself, Bianca Parisi, and my colleagues, Kent Reynolds and Cindy Rigg. Switch this slide, Kent, please. Located in the heart of the Niagara region, just minutes from one of the world's most well-known tourist destinations, Niagara College offers more than 130 innovative programs between our state-of-the-art campuses in Welland and Niagara-on-the-Lake. The college's Object Repository, or CORE, is a collaborative initiative aimed at creating access to unique digital content by participating Ontario colleges. Its foundation is a shared, multi-institutional repository built, managed, and supported by Ontario College Library Services, or OCLS. CORE is built on Islandora, an open source software framework with Canadian roots. Assistance with theming and implementation was provided by Discovery Garden and the BC Electronic Library Network. In 2017, the Ontario College System celebrated its 50th anniversary. We at Niagara College saw this as an occasion to start populating our new digital repository with college artifacts and memorabilia. With a little more exposure to the archive, we were able to acquire items of significance. Hoping to expand the use of our repository from archival purposes, we reached out to various departments in the college. The GIS program was looking for a digital space to store student reports. These student report exemplars are necessary for current students to review. We were able to sell our repository to the program coordinator, and a new purpose was born. Although we received a lot of positive interest in CORE, we were slow to acquire items.
When we left work on the 13th of March, 2020, we had no idea what the world was about to experience due to the pandemic. Classes were temporarily suspended to give us all a chance to adjust and shift all programming online. We did not have an e-reserve system in place, so we began to consider how the repository could be used to put as many learning materials as possible online. Other than our digital archive, we've been able to use CORE for course reserves, database lunch and learn, open text Tuesdays, open education resources, living library, and a co-op opportunity. With access to the physical reserve collection now off limits, the repository took on a new e-reserves role. Our business programs contributed course readings, case studies, and student projects. Access to these items are password protected for just staff and students at the college. CORE gave us a new purpose for offering teaching and learning materials. The library hosted a database lunch and learn series where vendors were invited to present an instructional session to college staff on specific e-resources. These sessions were recorded and added to CORE. The recordings now allow us to offer consistent, reliable instructions to our users.
Open Text Tuesdays is another series where library staff present open education resources to faculty. We have found a growing interest in open education resources at the college. These sessions provide an opportunity for faculty to learn more about OER. Our Open Text Tuesday series sparked interest in a few faculty members who have developed their own subject-specific OER. The flexibility of CORE allows students free 24/7 access to their course materials. We've also hosted OER discussion panels, and the recordings of these are also available. As the college expands its OER initiatives, it is our goal that the repository will play a prominent role in the adaptation, adoption, and creation of more OER faculty publications. Another initiative we have started is the Living Library Speaker Series. Guest speakers present on inclusive social topics. This past February, we hosted an event for Black History Month. We received positive feedback from faculty who use this event as a supplemental teaching tool. With this ability to ingest recordings into CORE, we have been able to easily share links to our students' learning management system, Blackboard. Taking a slightly different approach to teaching and learning, we welcomed a library and information technician student for a co-op placement. With the online learning environment, the placement had to take on a different approach. Her work with the repository was both beneficial to us as well as to her overall learning experience. It provided an opportunity for her to both contribute to the ingesting of teaching and learning resources at Niagara, and also to gain a perspective compared to a regular hands-on working experience. Although the use of CORE during the pandemic has been positive, we continue to face some challenges that will be ongoing. We work closely with our expert team to ensure copyright compliance and password protection of student copyrighted material. The other positive challenge is that we have more archival items to ingest into the repository than time allows. This past year has challenged many of us. However, a more consistent workflow with the repository would be a goal. Moving forward, we intend to grow the repository. We have pivoted and embraced the capabilities of CORE to meet the needs of online teaching and learning. When first embarking on this digital project, we thought it would be a great initiative and for an archive, and it is. The pandemic gave us an opportunity to use this resource for other, more inclusive purposes. It is our hope that the digital repository will continue to grow and be used by our college community. Thank you.
So thank you very much. This is the end of this session, and we had already 3 questions answered in the Q&A area, and they have already been responded. So feel free to look at this area as well. And then there is an open question about SADI from Maria Maestrovskaya, who is looking forward to a collaboration. So this is very interesting. And Sadi, you can look over the question as well. Is there anyone else who has any other questions? Well, in that case, I have 2 different questions for 2 different people. Well, I have 3 questions, but I don't know how we are in terms of time. But with regards to this very last question, I was wondering if you have the traffic of your repository before COVID and after COVID, and if you can tell whether there has been like a very, like approximately what has been like the increase in the traffic.
As in, so are you talking about numbers or what?
Yes.
Okay, so prior to COVID, we didn't get any responses. We had marketed this probably once a month, and no one was interested. We also used a different announcement than the research profiles as a service announcement, which was one of the reasons why we changed it. What we did previously, prior to COVID, was just talk about the institutional repository and the fact that, you know, the benefits of depositing the research, and you know, like I said, we didn't get any responses. So after 2 weeks, we received approximately 3 to 4 requests, and then 2 weeks after that, we received about 4 to 5, and you know. It doesn't sound like a lot, but when, you know, each faculty's CV is about 7 to 10 pages long, it does add quite a bit of content to the IR. And because it created such an increase in the workload for our staff member, we actually decided to hold off on the marketing until they could catch up with the long queue that had been created. So we have about a month and a half, 2 months worth of data to work from. So if that helps.
Yes, that's very interesting. And And is there still anyone from the Niagara College of Canada to say whether there has been a difference in the amount of like the visits in the traffic for the repository? No, I think they're not. Maybe they went to another
no, we're here still.
Oh, yes. Sorry.
We're still, sorry. We do have the ability to run stats on usage, and to be quite honest, we haven't done that. Just on top of all the other things we're juggling. But we have had, similar to what Agnes had said in the beginning, you know, that's kind of what precipitated the title. We've got a repository, now what do we do with it? Because we also had very little interest in it. And so we were having to find our ways to be creative and to sort of sell it or market it. So it really was through just a lot of talking and a lot of dialogue with faculty and professors that word started to get out. So that was helpful. And then when we had to pivot to online learning, it just made it a little bit easier to sell it. It was more of a reminder like, hey, remember we have this, what can we do to help you with it? So I'd like to think we've had increased uptake and increased interest, but to be truthful, we haven't actually, you know, crunched any numbers yet.
Yeah, I recommend that you check it because maybe you're going to be surprised with the numbers that you see.
It'd be a nice surprise.
We should probably allow now a transition time for the next session. So yes. So,
thank you very much, everyone, then, for attending this session.
Yes, and at the next top of the hour, we'll start with the next group of 24/7 presenters. So I'm going to turn off the recording now and then turn it back on again when we start that session. So. But I should remind everyone we are still live streaming this. So this is still being live streamed even in that interim piece. So just as an FYI.
I can't see it on the screen while I'm screen sharing the slide, but just to let you know, I'm intending to start with Maria from University of Toronto Libraries, in case there's any prior prep you want to do to get ready for it, but I'll start there and then I'll work down the list as I've got them, which hopefully is the same as everyone else.
Alan, this is Christina. I was looking at the list in the notes document. Could you just read off that list for us so we know who goes before us?
Yeah, give me a second. I shall find. I'll try and find the appropriate window for it. I mean, the list in the order I had them, which may not be the same, was University of Toronto Libraries, Educopia, DataCite, Penn State, Samvera, then University of Minnesota. So I had you second.
That's really helpful. Thank you.
Okay.
Hi, Alan. Just testing my audio.
Yeah, that's working.
Thank you.
Alan, I'll let you know when I turn back on the recording or when I'm about to do that. So I'll just do that, I guess now, since according to my clock, it's 9. So let me just start that up again. Done. And we are live streaming. So
thank you. Hi, everyone. I'm Alan Stiles from the Open University. I'm hosting this session, the third session of 24/7 presentations at Open Repositories. I'd just like to remind everyone that we do operate under a code of practice for ensuring inclusivity and equality for everyone. If you experience anything that you think is a violation of this code, do let the chairs know or contact the email address that you should already have had previously. We'd also like to thank all of the sponsors of the conference, without whom none of it would ultimately happen. All conferences have costs, and these guys have been supporting open access and open repositories for quite some time, and we are very grateful to them. Just to remind everyone that the session is being recorded so that it can be published in the future on Zenodo and also on YouTube, and it's currently being live streamed. There's a reminder at this point to everyone to hang around and go to the social space in Wonder after this. And my own personal apologies to anyone whose names I completely mash in the attempts to introduce them. But if you could all stick to time, that would be great. We've got 6 presentations to get through in the next hour and some questions. Any questions, please put them in the Q&A section and people will endeavor to answer them at the first possible opportunity. So first up, we should have Maria Maestrovskaya from University of Toronto Libraries in Canada, talking about taking small steps towards accessible repository content.
Hi, everyone. Give me one moment to share my screen. And I hope everyone can hear me.
We can, thanks.
Perfect. And I hope everyone can also see my presentation.
Yeah, thank you.
Wonderful. All right. Hi, everyone. My name is Maria Maestrovskaya, and I'm a digital publishing librarian at the University of Toronto Libraries. My talk is about content accessibility in institutional repositories, and I hope you will find it complementary to earlier presentation by Sadi Rusa from MIT. To start, I want to acknowledge the fact that many of us here have probably inherited repositories with content created before accessibility was brought to the forefront, have been faced with mandates or moral motivation to provide accessible content, have received little or no additional funding for accessibility work, and had to learn everything from scratch and are probably still learning. So if you feel like you're not doing enough, you're not alone. We are all probably not doing enough. And this presentation is about the small steps we can take today that might not change the world right away, but may set us on the right path there. A few words about our context. The University of Toronto is the largest Canadian institution by enrollment and has the 3rd largest library system in North America. Our institutional repository is called TSpace, and as you may have guessed, it's based on DSpace. In fact, it was one of the early adopters. We have over 96,000 items and only host full text and only fully open access materials. We are based in the province of Ontario, which means that we fall under the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act, which has a requirement for all public institutions to make their websites WCAG AA 2.0 compliant by January 1st, 2021. So in very simplistic terms, these are the core considerations you're likely looking at when approaching accessibility in your repository. There is platform accessibility and there is content accessibility. And for content, it's the accessibility of existing content in the repository and of content going forward. I'm only going to mention platform accessibility briefly because this is not the focus of my talk. We use a custom theme with our DSpace platform. It was developed a few years ago with accessibility in mind. We audited it again last year using a combination of automated tools, human testers, and screen readers as part of an overall accessibility audit of library sites.
And we subsequently resolved a few issues that we identified. If you're curious, the part that took the longest was this collapsible accordion community and collections menu. But the thing I'm here to talk about is content. T-Space has 96,000 items, most of which are text-based documents in PDF, which is known to not be the most accessible scholarly format. And it's not just the number, but also the size. 25,000 of these items are theses and dissertations, each several hundred pages long. Due to the sheer volume and no additional funding, it wasn't practical to remediate them all. Instead, we introduced an option to report an accessibility issue or request an alternate format. Currently, these options are present in the footer of each page, and this is a standard footer across all library sites. We partnered with the library's accessibility office that provides alternate formats for subscription materials to registered students. And they were open to expanding the service to remediating repository materials by request. We were kind of cautious because we did not have a good sense of the volume of requests. We did not make this option as prominent as it honestly should be, and we have not received any requests since it was added last year. So I think we're at the point where we could add it to the individual item template. And if you know of repositories that have this implementation, please put links in the chat for me to take a look when I'm done talking. Where I felt we could make more of a difference was in addressing accessibility of new content as it comes in. Here we worked in several different directions. The first one was the repository's content policy. As of this year, it has the provision that submitters should make their files accessible in compliance with the AODA where practicable. Here, in consultation with the university's accessibility office, we defined the scope of practicable as being in control of the author, like a report or a submitted or accepted manuscript of a paper, as opposed to the final published version, which is formatted by the publisher. And I think my MIT colleague has covered enough why that is out of scope. Obviously, this is a big ask, and we offer our assistance with making documents accessible, which brings me to the next direction. Accessibility of, mediated deposits. We have a long-standing mediated deposit service, primarily for faculty members who need to comply with funders' open access mandates. Because publisher policies and versions can be tricky to figure out, we chose to have trained deposit assistants to do that. We also collaborate with departmental libraries to cross-train student assistants at those libraries to do deposits for their faculty. And we approached document accessibility in the same way. It is easier to train an assistant to perform remediation than to train individual authors, although I do believe that such training is beneficial and it's offered more and more by other entities on campus, but it's hard to add it to the repository scope. So starting in 2020, we added accessibility check and remediation to our mediated deposit procedures. Our workflow only makes structural changes and not content changes. For example, we would fix headings, lists, tables, and alt text, but if there is a graph that was created with color reliance, we won't redo that. I'm including a link to the guidelines put together by my student assistant. It's a living document and you're welcome to add your comments and suggestions to it. And by the way, these slides are available at the tiny URL that's in the upper left corner. And I also added that link to the Google Doc for the session. All right. As I mentioned previously, a significant portion of the repository's original content is thesis and dissertations. While our School of Graduate Studies does not require submitted thesis to be accessible, they were forthcoming in incorporating accessibility instructions for students. First, we checked that the thesis template is accessible, and it is, as it uses styles and proper levels. We host this big workshop twice a year together with the School of Graduate Studies and our Scholarly Communications and Copyright Office on thesis formatting, submission, copyright, and publishing. So we incorporated a section on creating accessible documents and also added these instructions to our LibGuide for the course, which I'm also linking on this slide. So to sum up, start with new content. What policy and workflow changes do you need to make for new repository content to come in an accessible form? If you cannot remediate all existing content, provide an option to request an accessible version. Demand may not be as overwhelming as you think, and your library's accessibility services may be able to help. Work with significant content creators on campus, such as students submitting their thesis, to provide training and resources on creating accessible content. You're likely not working in the space alone, and there may be partnership opportunities with other departments and stakeholders. These are all things I wanted to highlight, and I hope it was helpful, and welcome your questions during the question period or by email. Thank you.
Thanks, Maria. It's really interesting. Mirrors some of our experiences of trying to deal with accessibility of content as well. Next up, I have Christina Drummond, who's going to talk from Educopia Institute in the US, and Christina's going to talk to us about navigating OA ebook usage data, stakeholder interests to facilitate cross-platform data exchange. Good luck.
It's a mouthful. We often call it OA EBU, and I think of my little French owl. But we're shifting from kind of thinking about deposits to thinking about usage and impact of those deposits, in particular ebooks. So my name is Christina Drummond. I'm the program officer for the Open Access Ebook Usage Data Trust, the OA EBU pilot, which is a global multi-stakeholder effort that's piloting community-governed shared solutions to address the challenges to impact reporting, which is frankly really difficult for open access books, as some of you may know if you're already working on that. Our project is in its second phase of funding through the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, but has its origins at SCI in 2015. And what I wanted to highlight here is some of the work that we've been doing over the past 2 years, really building an international community to understand the book usage data ecosystem, while also piloting some of the open source infrastructure for a data trust and the governance, policy, and sustainability mechanisms that would be needed to do that as well. Before I jump in, I just want to highlight that the problem our effort kind of centers around is how authors, their institutions, and their funders, all of them want to understand the usage and impacts of their books across the web, regardless of which repository, website, or service where those books are situated, where people discover those books. The publishers, institutional repositories, metric services, dissemination platforms all generate usage data to inform that picture. But the challenge is to understand the impact of a given book. You need to understand usage across all of those data streams. And merging and aggregating that data is time consuming and riddled with a lot of challenges. That's where the data trust as a potential solution comes in. To date, we've engaged dozens of thought leaders representing leading organizations and projects working on OA book analytics. In addition to our PIs, we have 20 individuals from across 5 continents informing our advisory board and our technical advisory group. But given that, I think it's important to just think about, well, what is it we're trying to do and what's a data trust? So for those of you who haven't heard of a data trust or a data space, I'd suggest you think of it as a data brokerage service model more than a repository of repositories. When our efforts started, we knew that data trusts were emerging in civil society as a way for public and private partners to govern and share data access and to aggregate data for reporting purposes across controlled or sensitive data sets. And through formal data stewardship and governance protocols, they could make it possible to do this across competitors. To do that, of course, there has to be trust. And these intermediaries really depend on that sense of community and reciprocity. I'll note that over the past year, we've also learned that in the European Union, there's a proposed Data Governance Act. And within it, there's this concept of a data altruism organization that truly functions as a highly regulated nonprofit entity that really functions as an independent, neutral broker of data for a given industry. So what we're looking at is, can we take this and use the data trust as a flavor of data space to facilitate data exchange and economies of scale, specifically for usage data for open access ebooks? To do that, though, we have to understand what our data ecosystem looks like, what usage data ecosystem looks like, and the supply chain therein. But before that, I just wanted to note that there's this importance, and a big challenge that the data trust solves is one around data governance mechanisms and what you need to do to really facilitate that cross-platform data sharing and processing. So to foster data transfer and use across parties, we have to navigate things such as the data terms of use, cybersecurity and privacy requirements, and needed access controls to ensure that any usage data that comes in is managed consistent with data provider expectations. In our project, we're modeling not only the technical controls, but also looking at what is still needed in terms of recommended practice to guide the aggregation visualization of this usage data with other linked information, and the ethical use of that as well. One of the reports that's been very instrumental to us in this project is the Open Data Institute's Designing Trustworthy Institutions report, which surfaces differing expectations of trust participants, depending on if you're one who provides data, which is that first column, if you're a downstream data user, which is the middle, or an organization or individual affected by data use. As a repository, for example, if you wanted to share your usage data with a data trust and be a data provider, you'd of course want to have a clear understanding of what rules and controls are in place for your data, and assurance that participation would protect your reputation and provide you with a value that outweighs any expense in terms of your time or money that would be required to participate. But if your repository also participated as a user of that data coming out of a data trust, perhaps it's to leverage benchmarking data that was created across all of the participants or to access clean aggregate data, you'd want a fair, equitable access to reliable data that's updated in a timely manner. You'd also want assurance that that data is appropriate to your needs and that data quality and data processing algorithms are transparent. Finally, I think it's also important here to remember that third column, which is to think about the expectations of the people impacted. So if institutions are choosing between working with your repository or another, you'd want assurance that participating in the data trust would do no harm to your organization. So there are a lot of different dynamics here that we're trying to manage across this ecosystem of players. And it's important to know, well, who are those players? So for our project, we had Michael Clark and Laura Ritchie mapping out the ebook data supply chain, which surfaced the usage data flows for us between those who fund OA content, distribute it, catalog it, and those reader interfaces at the far end. And so you'll see here all the different types of stakeholders, publishers, institutional repositories, metric services that are generating data within this ecosystem. And only those that are shaded in light pink on the screen provide the counter-compliant report outputs, which is a standard for those of you who don't know it about usage data reporting. And I want to draw your attention to the pink circles, which is really one of the challenges that we're trying to create to solve here, where usage is coming in multiple streams, and each of these parties have to bring together that data to tell the story of a single book. And they have to use time and staff resources to curate and aggregate that information where it's even feasible. And alleviating that pressure is one of the things that we're trying to look at. And potentially maybe provide an economy of scale by making it easier for everyone to do this across the ecosystem, while also bringing on board smaller organizations who may not have those resources available to do this. So another piece we had to understand for the data ecosystem is how are people using the data? And I just wanted to note here before we end that one of the things that surfaced for us is that usage data isn't just about counts and downloads, but there's really interest across parties to link that data to marketing and communications, sales, author IDs, funding and collection. And the critical thing here to note is that not only is there a common interest around that data management and curation, but there's some key areas where there potentially could be challenges to independence and neutrality. And so this is where you'll see those exclamation marks, but anytime a data provider, such as a repository, may put data in, if publishers and libraries want to use that information to select and move across platforms, that could potentially be challenging. And so one of the things that our trust is looking at right now is whether dashboards could be provided in analytical products from a data trust, while at the same time, we're trying to act as that neutral, independent broker in the middle. And so that's kind of where we're at right now, talking through some of those challenges and issues. So to recap, as we're entering our last quarter of the current project, we've identified many ways where we can simplify data usage, usage data curation and aggregation for ebooks. But we've also noted a number of challenges that our ecosystem we need to tackle, from improving standards and interoperability across library and book publisher sectors to facilitating standards adoption, especially among our smaller data providers. And I'll also note there's this really big area to develop ethical guidelines for usage data analytics. So with that, our work is ongoing. And if any of these are of interest to you, I would just encourage you to join us. And you can see the link in the bottom right of your screen. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Christina. Next up, we have Liz Kersnerich from DataCite Service Providers Program.
All righty, let me share my screen. And how's that? Can you see my slides?
Not yet. I can see you.
Oh dear. Let's try that again.
Yep, that's sharing.
All right, great. So I am Liz Kersnerich. I am the adoption manager for DataCite and also the Research Organization Registry Initiative. And I'm here to talk a little bit about the Service Providers Program that we introduced fairly recently. But before I get into that, just so everyone's on the same page, I'll give you a little bit of background about DataCite. So we are a DOI registration agency, basically. We're specifically focused on data and other research outputs. Our original mandate was to try to make data more citable and also help to make it more reusable, hence DataCite. We're a nonprofit organization and we work mostly with research institutions and particularly data and institutional repositories all over the world. So you're probably all familiar with DOIs, digital object identifiers, and we won't go into the technical details of that in this presentation, but you're probably most familiar with them in the context of published articles on publisher websites. So we do DOIs for basically everything that is not that. So research data sets, gray literature that you find in institutional repositories, and more recently, all sorts of other stuff like data management plans, scientific instruments, and a bunch of other emerging use cases. So our core service that we provide is allowing members to create and manage DOIs. We do a whole host of other things related to making data sets more discoverable and other research outputs more discoverable, but basically we run DOI registration services. We have a web interface where you can do this, and we also run a bunch of APIs that support registering and updating DOIs. Web interface, great if you want to register and manage a few DOIs, not so great if you have hundreds or thousands. Many repository platforms integrate our APIs to support DOI registration, both kind of the off-the-shelf platforms and the custom repositories developed by individual organizations. So that's great. However, at DataCite, we're community driven and we like to make everything open metadata, open tools and services. This has a downside when it comes to our APIs because it means there are lots of different types of DOI registration integrations out there. So not every platform is doing it the same way. And we don't build those integrations ourselves. So not all of them quite do everything exactly as you might want. So in the fall this past year, we launched a service providers program with the goal of helping both repositories and developers implement DOI best practices. So by service provider, we mean an organization or individual that builds or supports systems used by other organizations to register DOIs. So we mean your repository and CRIS platforms that you can download or purchase off the shelf, or those folks who are developing custom software integrations. The requirements of this program are pretty simple. So integrating DataCite DOI registration into a system according to DOI registration best practices that we have, and also providing documentation and support for those integrations. The upshot for repositories is high quality DOI registration integrations with good support and documentation. And that's really a major goal of this program, as well as consistency among DOI registration integration. So if you have multiple systems, they're all kind of working the same way. Another really important aspect of this program is that we work collaboratively with our service providers. So this program gives you some assurance that your system developers and providers are active participants in the DataCite community and they're advocating on their users' behalf. On the flip side, for the organizations who are registered as service providers, of course, we list them in our service provider directory. You get a shiny badge to put on your website. And again, importantly, you get an opportunity to participate in quarterly meetings where you can learn about and provide input on DataCite features. Let us know if we're planning something that's going to really impact your users badly, so we can not do that thing. And then we have some additional opportunities with our product team to do some work on future product development, idea validation. So you may be wondering, who are these service providers so far? Since we launched the program, we have a few who have joined. So the batch in the middle are all DSpace service providers, and then Figshare, Dataverse, Peer, Esploro, Haplo, PSNC. We have two more who are working on service provider status right now, which are ePrints and Invenio. And so we'll see them join hopefully in the next couple of months. If you are a software or a system developer and you're developing products for other organizations, you can become a registered service provider. Make sure you meet our requirements. There's an application form that you could submit, and then we'll review your integration. So what's coming up next for this program is that, of course, new service providers, we're also looking to build a more detailed catalog of those integrations that are out there. And of course, we're looking to add more service providers. So if you are working with a repository platform that doesn't support DOI integration or isn't listed on that service provider list, tell us about it. You can contact us at info@datacite.org. Let us know who you would like to see us try to recruit into this program. And of course, developers and vendors, let us know if you're interested in becoming a service provider. So that's it for me. I have a list of resources that I will post when I upload my slides to the Zenodo repository.
Thanks, Liz. I was having a brief moment whilst I chased the unmute button around the screen. Next up, I have Daniel Coughlin, Seth Erickson, and Adam Weed from Penn State University talking about reopening the repository.
Sorry, I was having the same troubles finding my mute button and whatnot. Yeah, so I'm Dan Coughlin, presenting with Seth Erickson on Penn State's institutional repository, ScholarSphere. I'm the department head of Library Strategic Technologies at Penn State. For simplicity, that's our IT department. And Seth works in our research informatics and publishing department as a research data librarian. And one of his responsibilities is the product owner of ScholarSphere. So I'll talk a little bit about the challenges we faced and decisions we had to make with our latest version of the IR, and Seth's going to go into a little bit more detail on the features we developed and why or how we made those decisions. So 2019, we essentially had 3 developers working on ScholarSphere. They had other responsibilities, but they were a team of 2 full stack developers and 1 developer that focused more on front-end development, spent a lot of time on ScholarSphere. 2 of those developers left in 2019. We quickly went from 3 to 1. In late summer of 2019, we'd be given a 25 gigabyte data set of ANT videos to be uploaded to ScholarSphere. So we had no ability to allow a user to do that on the front end. So essentially this required about a month of a developer's time to get us to a point where these videos were successfully sort of uploaded. And then finally, at Penn State, we're about to pass an open access policy at this time. And we knew ScholarSphere would be the repository to support this policy. So we needed our repository to provide an API to other systems it would integrate with for a successful open access policy implementation. Our existing ScholarSphere implementation at that time was built on Samvera technologies. And one of the challenges we had was keeping our code base in sync with the progress that was being made and the pace of development that was going on within the community. So upgrading to the latest version of various gems we depended on was going to require a significant amount of development on our end. And in this work, we weren't positive we'd get the features we wanted. So we decided to take a couple months in exploring a rewrite on a new platform that we were comfortable with. So in October of 2019, we started with the new Rails application from scratch and had a couple goals for this platform and infrastructure that's set up. One, we could hire outside vendors and onboard developers quickly to do Rails development and jump right in. Two, we could scale to the larger needs than before using that video data set that I mentioned as a test bed of those AMP videos. And then the last one was we could more easily create our development environments and more accurately represent our production environment, specifically our network detached storage. So we had a number of infrastructure smells, but for the sake of time, just probably two most important are the scaling and the ability to bring up a development environment. So there are things that we also liked about the repository that we had that we want to make sure we kept. One, we looked briefly at Elasticsearch, but ultimately decided we'd stick with Solr and Blacklight. We had a lot of success with those. Two, we had a strong data model, so we didn't want to remodel all of our data and have a even more difficult data migration. This grew out of the Samvera community, the PCDM data model. And lastly, our access levels. So we had a public and Penn State level of access to our content. And there were a handful of things we could get rid of, but we found through the years that we weren't providing value that we had anticipated when rolling them out. So we did get rid of some things. And by the end of 2019, we felt that a month or so of exploration was valuable enough to continue working towards a rewrite. So we'd successfully onboarded a Rails developer from a local consulting company. And comparing an AMP video upload where ScholarSphere in 2019 was giving you a message that the file was too large, so required a month of developer time, we went to a QA instance that was able to upload these files in just a couple of minutes. So there's some value in that. We also went from essentially it taking about a week for us to get a developer up to speed in the environment to do some work. It went to a couple hours. So speed was a big part of it in multiple ways. And we'd begun developing an API that when we migrated data from one version of ScholarSphere to the next, we were able to leverage using that API and provided us with some confidence in the success of that. So an additional outcome is that having a system that provides a way to meet user needs instead of having a developer forcing data into a system for a month is likely a happier and healthier developer. So we released the new version of ScholarSphere in November of 2020. We had about 3 developers working on it for the better part of a year, along with a product owner, Seth, who's going to talk a little bit. And one developer was technically doing a lot of development. We had and coordinating a lot of development. We had a consultant that was working closely with that tech lead and a DevOps developer that was re-architecting our infrastructure to make life easier for the developers and our users, and our product owner guiding the priorities and acceptance testing of those features. And so now Seth's going to speak more specifically about some of the features we rolled out in our latest version.
So with the remainder of our time, I'm going to talk about some additional goals for ScholarSphere and new features we introduced with the update. Since ScholarSphere initially launched way back in 2012, a lot has changed in the world of open access institutional repositories. I'm thinking of trends around research data like FAIR standards and broadening concerns for computational reproducibility. And on the publishing side, the general climate around institutional support for open access has really expanded. So the redevelopment effort was an opportunity for us to realize some of these positive trends locally. And there are 2 particular features that demonstrate this best. Next slide, please. The first of these is versioning. Here you can see how changes between versions in works are presented on ScholarSphere. So I think of versioning as the ability for researchers to update previously deposited materials without interfering with access to materials that have already been shared. It's an important feature for supporting computational reproducibility and transparency, and it's increasingly common in IRs. Next slide, please. Some of the key questions we puzzled through in our implementation of versioning are listed here. So what kinds of changes to a work constitute a new version? Should researchers need to create a new version to change, for example, the title or the contributors? And what about the license? The license was a particular sticking point for us. Next, how should works and versions be, sorry, go back. How should works and versions be uniquely identified? So should their semantic versioning be enforced? And what kinds of access restrictions like embargoes apply to versions versus works? And now the next slide, please. So the approach to versioning that we settled on is represented here. Works deposited to ScholarSphere exist as a series of versions, and each version is its own bundle of descriptive metadata and files. So with respect to the question above, our policy is that a change in the metadata of a published version requires the creation of a new version. And with respect to identifiers, ScholarSphere currently only supports work level identifiers. However, version level DOIs are something we plan for the future. And semantic versioning is optional, but it's not enforced. Next slide, please. Versions exist in one of three states. They can be draft, published, or withdrawn. A draft version is particularly important as it provides an opportunity for curators to work with researchers before they finalize their deposits. A work can only have one draft at a time, which prevents branching. And then the most recently published version of a work is the authoritative version that's shown to users to represent the work as a whole. So next slide, please. So another important goal of ScholarSphere is to facilitate the implementation of Penn State's new open access policy, which Dan mentioned. It was introduced earlier this year. It's a university-wide policy that requires Penn State faculty to provide the libraries with open access versions of recent journal articles or receive a waiver. And depositing to ScholarSphere satisfies the requirement of the policy, but we can also receive open access articles through integrations between ScholarSphere and Penn State's promotion and tenure system, the system through which faculty manage dossiers. Then the library also manages a database of faculty publications through which we also receive publications. So there's all these sources where journal articles can come from. And so to support this, we developed an API. We have a RESTful API that supports automated deposits and a GraphQL API that supports querying works in ScholarSphere. Next slide, please. These APIs aren't meant to be used beyond integrations between applications that we've developed, so they aren't public, but they are very useful. And with the adoption of Penn State's open access policy and with the benefit of the API, the number of deposits in ScholarSphere has really grown in the last year. Next slide, please. So this is just some of what we've been working on with ScholarSphere. Our work is very much ongoing. And I do want to thank Adam Weed, who was the lone developer in question earlier. And thanks for your attention. I think you're muted.
It was going to happen one time. Thank you. Up next, for the penultimate session, I think we have Rosalind Metz and Heather Greer-Klein from Samvera and Emory University in the United States, talking about sustaining open infrastructure communities and evaluating fiscal and administrative service options.
Great, thanks, Alan. Hi, folks. I'm Heather Greer-Klein. I'm the community manager of the Samvera community, and I'll be presenting today on behalf of myself and Rosalind Metz, who's the chair of the Samvera board. So I'm going to talk today about the services an open infrastructure community requires and how the manner in which a community receives those services can impact sustainability. And I'll discuss how the Samvera community leadership came up with criteria to evaluate potential providers of these services. And I'll share a tool we developed to help us with this evaluation process. And I'll speak briefly to the value Samvera gained by going through this process. So there is fiscal and administrative labor required to support an open infrastructure community. There is funding that will flow to the community to support events or development. There will be legal questions and contracts to sign. And at a certain size, a community may want to have dedicated staff. There's always an option to form a standalone nonprofit or similar entity, but doing so increases all of this labor exponentially. Most projects will find a way to take advantage of economies of scale instead. So looking across the open community landscape, communities have found a home at many larger organizations. Sometimes this home is selected intentionally, and sometimes it's a matter of convenience or an existing good relationship. And these arrangements have many different names and forms. In the United States, the practice of fiscal sponsorship has long been a way for smaller entities to benefit from the existing infrastructure of a larger nonprofit organization. The services provided generally require at least a cost recovery fee to cover staff time spent on the community and access to other resources. So the Samvera community first established a fiscal sponsorship with DuraSpace in 2015 because DuraSpace was an existing partner in the community and they had the infrastructure to support the community for an annual fee. And in July of 2019, DuraSpace merged with Lyrasis. And about a year ago, the Samvera community renewed its existing agreement with Lyrasis. And per that agreement, Lyrasis kindly allowed the community to continue as an independent program for 1 year, paying a lower fee and receiving a smaller set of fiscal sponsorship services as compared to what a full Lyrasis community-supported program would receive. And at the time of renewal, Lyrasis asked the Samvera steering group to use the following year to explore becoming a Lyrasis community-supported program. So the group took this opportunity to think deeply about what the community needs from a fiscal sponsor partnership and to evaluate the options available in the ecosystem. Preparing for this evaluation started with a lot of conversations about all the ways that a service partnership can impact the community. The fee charged for the service and the availability or options for staffing are clear examples, as is access to funding that a community could or could not otherwise engage with. And different partnerships also provide access to different types of infrastructure, such as website design, management, and access to existing software subscriptions. And governance autonomy is an important consideration, and it's one that varies widely depending on the structure of the agreement, and if your community is looking for more guidance or more independence. Most importantly for sustainability is to have a clear understanding of what happens if one of the parties needs to end the partnership. So for example, is the option to be sponsored by a friendly institution likely to change if there is a change in leadership at that institution? A great deal of research and conversations with other communities helps us to identify a number of criteria that we use to rank potential partner organizations. We had a deep discussion about what each of these criteria meant to us, clarifying and creating more fleshed out definitions during that discussion. And to do the work of comparing options across these criteria, we adapted a spreadsheet that had previously been used for candidate screening. The process worked well for us and we are excited to share it. So to use the tool, a community needs to determine their own criteria, and the tool includes the criteria that the Samvera community used, and it can be easily customized. And multiple evaluators each make their own selections for each potential organization. So in our case, the organizations presented to the steering group, and we engaged in conversation and questions about each other's organizations and our goals. And the results were just a starting point for further conversations. But using this tool allowed the group to be very clear and objective about how each organization matched with the criteria that we selected. And having those close at hand led to in-depth and productive discussions with these potential partners. And at the end of our discussion, we came to the decision that of the organizations we investigated, Oasis Open offered the community the experience that most closely matched our current relationship with Lyrasis. So while some may see this change of fiscal and administrative partner as a major one, the reality is that this is the option that requires our community to change the least. So going through the evaluation process meant that we were confident in our decision and well prepared to communicate it to the wider community. And our Samvera partners voted unanimously in support of this change. And if you're not familiar with OASIS Open, it's a nonprofit, international, and member-driven 501c6 founded in 1993. And they provide support for open standards and open source development. They're the home of some familiar standards like SAML. And groups at OASIS work autonomously, setting their own goals, making their own decisions, but sharing the OASIS commitment to openness, transparency, and inclusivity. Because of our very intentional approach to this evaluation, we were able to recognize that what OASIS offered in their foundation as a service program would allow us to become a legal entity, maintaining our independence while benefiting from their fiscal and legal expertise. So I hope this experience and our tool can help other open infrastructure communities to evaluate existing and potential relationships to make sure that they are financially sustainable, aligned with needs, and secure for the long term. Approaching this intentionally offers an opportunity to learn more about the unique needs of your community and the partners available to meet those needs in the wider ecosystem. And thanks so much for your time. I'm always happy to talk to folks about this process. Feel free to reach out to me.
Thanks, Heather. Another interesting talk. As Nancy said in the previous session, I really do like 24/7. They provide a lot of information in a very short period of time. Okay, our final talk for the day comes from Eric Moore, Valerie Collins, and Lisa Johnston from University of Minnesota in the United States. An engaged campus repository in practice, the University of Minnesota's repository and the pandemic response.
Yeah, here I am. Great. Thank you very much, Alvin. So welcome to an engaged campus repository in practice. I am Eric Moore, and I will be presenting today on behalf of my co-authors, Valerie Collins and Lisa Johnston. The University Digital Conservancy is the institutional repository for the University of Minnesota. Built on DSpace 5 and administered by the university libraries, the repository program launched in 2007 with a focus on collecting the university's broad institutional output, including administrative and archival material of historical importance, not just scholarly works. So it serves as the digital arm of the university archives. Because of this ongoing work of repository staff, many publicly engaged units across the university turn to the Digital Conservancy for the necessary infrastructure to house, preserve, and make their research, gray literature, data, and publications freely available for public access to the communities they serve. At Open Repositories 2018, we presented on institutional repositories and their role in supporting public engagement at universities in the United States. Our conclusion proposed that institutional repositories are more than a vehicle for scholarly output. They play a strategic role in public engagement of research-based information. Specifically, we looked at shared concepts of repositories and public engagement as a common good with values based in the authenticity of the work and the trustworthiness of the resource. Since that presentation, we have further refined our understanding of the relationship between institutional repositories and public engagement in higher education. Rather than view institutional repositories solely as a tool to support open access scholarship and research, we now see the institutional repository as a component of the engaged campus, where community engagement is part of the teaching, research, and outreach mission of the university. The Digital Conservancy seeks to permanently capture content produced by university community partnerships. The studies, reports, plans, newsletters, information sheets, and data sets that are not found in published academic literature or through a library's catalog. And it does so by implementing three methods. First, we intentionally scope the IR beyond faculty scholarship. Instead, the focus of the recruitment strategy is centered on content that documents the university's activities, as well as the institution's broad research portfolio. In other words, the publicly available, university-produced reports and community-centered publications that are core to preserving the record of the university's engagement mission in the IR. Second, a significant number of repository uploads to the Digital Conservancy come directly from a distributed deposit model that rewards content contributors with timely dissemination of information. This distributed model empowers the contributing departments, research centers, and administrative offices to deposit content at or near the point of creation. These deposits are not the scholarship of individual faculty. Rather, they are the research and technical reports, informational bulletins, and newsletters produced at all levels of the university. Finally, for campus centers and offices that use their websites as clearinghouses to distribute information and publications, it is not the concept of open access that brings them to the institutional repository. They have been providing access all along. It is the permanence of the item and the persistent access to it, two major concerns for any content made available through a website. Thus, institutional repositories, while not a catalyst for public engagement, serve the common good by ensuring authenticity and trustworthiness in the management of public scholarship. IRs participate in reciprocal trust that is vital to public engagement. The practical application of pairing the digital preservation infrastructure of an institutional repository with community-informed research came to the forefront during the COVID-19 pandemic. As the public health crisis rapidly moved across North America, public health and government officials sought to contain and limit the spread of the virus. Schools and businesses closed, and individuals prepared for extended quarantines. At Minnesota, researchers working with a community advisory board on local sustainability surveyed rural grocery stores for common food items that could be used to create a 14-day quarantine food kit. They then developed an instructional guide to aid rural communities on how to prepare quarantine kits using supplies found in local businesses and grocery stores. This 4-page informational fact sheet was first made available through the repository on March 19th, 2020, at the end of the first week of the peacetime state of emergency and the implementation of social distancing guidelines in the United States. By our account, it is the first COVID-19 related research added to our repository. Over the next 2 weeks, it was downloaded 3,667 times from communities as far away from Minnesota as Iran. As the pandemic persisted and recommended 14-day quarantines gave way to shutting down all but essential services and isolating at home, people adjusted their sense of planning and preparedness. Regular downloads dropped dramatically to a total of 7,220 for the year. However, the immediacy and usefulness of this information resource, paired with the persistence and trustworthiness of the repository, demonstrates not just the ability of the repository to deliver content, but to actually be part of a public effort to save lives. Additional information sheets soon followed to demonstrate how to establish grocery store contactless pickup and strategies for remote learning, actionable research on some of the hallmark consequences of the pandemic. These examples are just the first of over 700 COVID-19 related resources added to the repository in the past year and attest to the value of institutional infrastructure paired with university community expertise in providing timely, persistent access to novel research designed to mitigate a public health crisis in communities with limited resources. Thank you.
Thanks, Eric. Seems like a very positive sort of option to finish the session on. If anyone has any questions that haven't been answered anywhere, do feel free to put them in the chat. I'm hoping that some of the participants are going to be able to make their way into the networking session after this, because there are a couple of conversations I'd quite like to carry on having. That's the end of your 7 minutes. So thank you for keeping to time, everyone. If nobody has anything else that they want to add, then I'll give you back another 5 minutes or so until the networking session. And thank you for attending. It's been great. Oh, Sarah.
Nope, you're fine. I was just going to say that I do hope people head over to the networking session to have some more conversations.
And once again, thanks to our conference sponsors and our infrastructure partners as well, the University of Arizona and the Digital Repository of Ireland, who've been providing so much of the Zoom hosting for us, and all the people running around in the background making things live stream to the right places at the right time. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.